I haven't told my story to many people except for my wife and a few other of my close friends. It happened while I was stationed in the Army as a radio operator during the Vietnam War, and I haven't forgotten it to this day. I was a young recruit, freshly drafted out of high school, and I didn't know much about the war. I had no idea what I was getting into or what it was all for, but what I did know was that I had a duty to my fellow servicemen. We arrived on a Friday evening and got loaded onto many buses to be taken to our barracks. The air was very humid, and the soil was soaking wet due to a storm that had just passed through the area. I vividly remember the drive and how it stunk like sewer. My first night was uneventful and quiet, but we all felt the tense atmosphere as our drill sergeants taunted us with stories during BAS training. I remember the half moon right over my head, which kept peeking out from over the clouds, and all of us were just sitting around telling jokes. I was more of a technical guy and didn't have much aptitude for comedy, so I just listened in. My duty was to manage communications between my unit and all of our other guys so that everyone knew what was going on everywhere else. I carried a box on my back, which were the size of radio devices back then, and also a ton more equipment and supplies. I was quickly assigned to a tight-knit unit who had just lost their communications operator to a landmine, and I remember the first time we made contact with the enemy. It was the loudest thing I ever heard. We were in a dense part of the jungle and couldn't see the enemy at all, but we quickly ducked as soon as they began firing at us, and we opened fire in their general direction in return. The chaos seemed to last forever, and we probably ceased fire after a couple of minutes. We advanced forward to close in on the enemy and secure the area, and it was the first time I ever saw the enemy up close. There they were, 3 dead Viet Cong soldiers laying in a pool of their own blood. I couldn't believe that I was looking at 3 human beings that were alive just moments ago, young guys who maybe had sisters or brothers and parents. They were probably just chilling around moments before we arrived, and here we are moments later looking at their motionless bodies. But I must say that I felt justified because they were the enemy, and they would have been standing over our dead bodies instead. A few days later, we got assigned to a different location which saw heavier casualties and needed more support. I grew accustomed to the violence and saw many of our young men die painfully. One day, I was told by my NCO that someone wanted to speak with me. I was greeted by an older man in his late 50s who looked totally out of place. His demeanor was calculated and predictive, and even my commanding officer seemed to have turned into a yes man in front of him. He introduced himself as RCK Henry, an intelligence officer stationed nearby, and said that I was going to be assigned to him as an RTO for his unit. I liked my unit and wanted to stay with them, but orders are orders, and I had no choice. So I got on the Huey and went with him. We landed in a heavily wooded area next to a few Viet Cong huts. It was heavily built up by the enemy, and I could definitely imagine the fight that must have taken place here. There were some guys who had gas masks on and others standing nearby, but they didn't seem to notice me or even care that I was there. It was a very strange atmosphere that didn't feel quite right. These guys didn't act like normal soldiers and definitely didn't have the look of fear in their eyes as most of us did. I even tried to talk with some of them, but all I got was a strange, emotionless glare like they were infected with something. Whatever it was, they all had it, and it made me feel very uneasy. Officer Henry and I entered one of the smaller huts, and I was told to stay put until someone would come and get me. I should have just stayed there and waited, but I was too curious and apprehensive to relax, so I made my way out towards the main tent and took a peek inside. What I saw made my stomach drop like it never had before. On a makeshift table lay 6 murky containers. Each one of them had a severed head of a guerrilla fighter inside, with several tubes and wires protruding from them. A green liquid seemed to be reacting with the heads as their mouths and eyes were quivering like they were half alive. I suddenly felt a hand grab onto my shoulder. It was Intelligence Officer Henry, and he looked very upset. I meekly asked what they were doing inside there, but he angrily said that I should not have gone in there and sent me back to my hut. We must have been attacked or something because I woke up a day later in triage with several broken ribs and a fractured collarbone with no memory of anything that happened right after that. I never saw Officer Frederick Henry or those soldiers ever again during my time, if that was even his real name, and I often wonder what those guys were doing back there. Maybe they were trying to gather intelligence from dead enemy soldiers or something. Either way, it was a strange experience that I'll never forget. That was near the end of my first tour of Iraq, from November 2006 to August 2007. It was July. We were RVing with Iraqi police, with the majority of our platoon sitting idle in the surrounding area on our M1151S. In the distance, we heard a few shots of small arms fire, which our second lieutenant wanted to investigate. I was the driver to the second squad leader in Spartan 2, and we generally took the lead with us. Our platoon, which was undermanned with 2 squads instead of 3 or 4, rolled out with 2 additional Iraqi army trucks and 2 Iraqi police trucks towards the suspicious gunfire outside the main village. There was a cluster of buildings, like a mini village, with one dirt and gravel road about half a mile long, with a drainage ditch on the left and a canal on the right. This is where leadership failed on a few counts. First, air drone recon was called and responding, yet we did not wait for recon to proceed. Second, dirt and gravel roads are avoided as much as possible because of the ease with which IEDs can be placed and hidden. Third, a secondary road was located but had clearly been intentionally blocked, making the main road suspicious and even more dangerous. Lastly, upon proceeding down the road, the Iraqi police escort claimed that we were going into an Al-Qaeda stronghold and promptly abandoned the convoy, which was ultimately ignored by the 2LT. An Iraqi army Humvee took point next to my truck, and another Iraqi truck with the remaining 7 US trucks proceeded down this road. Roughly halfway down, the lead truck stopped for some reason without radio contact. We had no idea why until I moved to the side a bit and saw a ditch across the road blocking safe passage forward. My squad leader got out to get some word with the Iraqis ahead and immediately jumped back in his seat. At that same moment, we came under small arms fire. He jumped back in, yelling about being shot at. Outside my driver's window, I saw 3 men pop up from tall grass about 50 meters directly beside my truck, firing AKs. My gunner called out a bongo truck to the frontier of the village with a mounted dushka, which is like a huge Russian version of a .50 cal. This was a typical L-shaped ambush, and I was front and center. No way forward, left, right, nor hasty retreat. Taking small arms and now heavy machine gun fire, my gunner engaged the bongo truck, and I could see the M240 turret kicking up dust around the 3 engaged on my left. I just sat there, unable to defend myself. Then came a bang, a flash of fire and smoke. I thought it was an IED. I felt a pinch on my left cheek and touched it, drawing back a heavily bloody glove. I slapped it back on and applied pressure, training kicking in immediately. I called out to the squad leader, "I'm bleeding," while I wondered if I was dying since I felt no pain. Unbeknownst to me, the time the fire suppression system had activated, the heavy gas made her voice sound super low, like the opposite of helium. It was like a movie betrayal in slow motion, and my senses were all messed up. I had enough of sitting there in the kill zone and started to reverse. The Iraqi truck behind me didn't get the hint until I rammed him about 2 or 3 times. Finally, we began to back slowly away, which isn't easy on a narrow road with one hand on the wheel, with only a single side mirror. No backup mirror, and the passenger side mirror was blocked from view. At some point, the medic had run up to my truck from about 3 back to jump in mine under fire. We managed to move the convoy far back enough that my squad leader could drive and the medic could tend to me. We eventually moved off the road and headed back to base while I sent up my own 9-line media on the Blue Force tracker. After being seen by medics and being flown by Blackhawk to Ballot Medical, I learned that I wasn't hit by an IED. The Dushka had penetrated the armor of my truck above the windshield, ricocheting off the roll bar beside my head and finally breaking apart, spraying shrapnel across my face. A few inches and I could have had a stump where my head was. The PTSD is an SOB still to this day, and the VA says I'll most likely never be free of it. This particular story took place when I was in the Air Force and stationed in Louisiana. This story took place a few years after I had been stationed there. I first arrived at this base in 2005, and upon my arrival, I, along with many other new troops, were greeted with many different stories of horror. There were stories about a man in a top hat who walked a dark, long, and narrow dirt road on the outskirts of a storage facility area. There was another story about a crazy man who was hit by a patrol car and ran off into the woods next to the same place. But my story relates to a separate story that was told to me. It was my second night on shift, as I recall. I was posted with an airman who had been there for several years. He gave a rundown about some little girl who had been visiting her father when the storage area we were working in was being constructed, which was well before any of our time. The story went that the little girl was playing on some of the structures while her father was working but had fallen to her death by slipping off the edge at the top of the structure itself. Most of the story didn't make sense to me at the time, but regardless of the facts, it still scared the out of me. To make matters worse, the airman had taken me to the exact place where the supposed story took place. He would shut off the engine and turn off the music as we just sat there in silence. He startled me a few times, but nothing ever happened. Now skip forward about 3 years. I was scheduled to work that particular spot of the base this night. Keep in mind that I'd been visiting this spot for years now, but at this point, the storage area had been completely closed down except for a few minor areas, which required us to do physical drive-thrus and checks of this area. The shift itself started out rather shitty. Me and my Steven partner had been given a cattle truck to do this patrol, as our normal vehicle was in the shop for maintenance. Yeah, I'm not kidding, but cattle truck. I know this part doesn't seem very important to the story at the moment, but it will tie into the story eventually. So to save on time, let's skip forward a few hours. We were scheduled to do 3 random checks of the storage facility that night, and we had already completed 2 of the 3 prior without any issues. So, come about 4 o'clock in the morning, we decided to do our last check. Seeing as all the main maintenance guys had gone home for the night in this area, the only way to access the area was with 2 very large separate gates, which took forever to open. We piled in, locked the gates behind us, and continued on our way. Steven was driving during this check, and I was the spotter who used the flashlight to check the lock on each structure. An important detail that I left out, which may be necessary here, is that the story of the little girl had taken place on a road within the storage area, which we called Echo Street. By this point, everything was fine, and we had finished our rounds. Steven made the final turn down Echo Street. We had both been pretty talkative during most of the night, and we were just shooting when I got an uneasy feeling. Something felt different, but I couldn't make out what it was. We were about halfway down the road when things became almost completely and frighteningly silent. Even the rumble of our cattle truck and the faint noise of the radio plane seemed to become less audible as we approached the structure from my previous story. And I must stress at this point that even telling or typing this part still brings a chill down my spine and makes my eyes tear up in fear. But as we approached the structure itself, I turned my head to the outside of the window opposite the structure, and out of my left ear, I heard a sound that nearly caused me to piss myself. It was the sound of a person groaning or moaning in distress, sort of like the moan of the girl from The Grudge. Yes, I'm very serious. The faint, creepy moan began to ring inside the cab of the truck between the 2 of us, in between the dark emptiness of the middle seat. I felt my blood turn cold, and I quickly turned to Steven and yelled, "Dude, cut that out." Steven turned to me with a confused look on his face. At this point, he began to take his foot off the accelerator and asked, "Am I going too fast?" I remained silent for a moment, with my hand in a pausing gesture, and I listened. I heard the noise again. My partner interrupted and asked, "What's wrong?" I quickly turned the music off without saying anything at first, and then I whispered to him, "Do you hear that?" He stopped the truck in confusion and listened closely. It was almost dead silent for a second or two when we both heard at this time that long, chilling groan of a woman. It echoed in my ears. It sounded like someone was struggling to breathe and taking in a giant breath of air while someone was trying to strangle them. The sound was beyond terrifying, and the fact that I wasn't the only one hearing it only made it more of a horrifying experience. I found myself beginning to ask him my original question again, but he quickly interrupted and said with a strong sound of fear in his voice, "What the is that?" We stupidly waited to see if we could hear it again. The rumble of the gates on the back of the truck was easily heard and recognized as they made a sort of metal-on-metal clatter, and the diesel engine had that typical rumble as well. But in between both the noises, we heard it again for the final time, that groan. It sounded even louder, but this time it sounded like it was coming from both inside and outside of the truck, like we were being surrounded by whatever was making that noise of distress. Without even making a peep, Steven put the truck in drive, and he hauled our asses off that street quicker than I have ever gone on any other street, and that entire base veered us off the road to speed back. He nearly flipped the truck going around a curve, but it didn't bother us one bit. We were both in an unspoken agreement that we wanted to get out of there quickly. We got to the 2 gates again, and I hopped out of the truck as fast as I could. Steven watched my back as I quickly opened both gates. He jumped back into the driver's seat, sped out, and waited for me to close both gates as well. Once we completed that task, we quickly returned to the main part of the base, and we requested to meet with our flight chief to tell him what had happened. When we finally met up with him, we expected him to think that we were both full of it or that we had just imagined the entire thing, being as it was so late into our 12-hour shift and we were both tired. But I clearly remember him saying to both of us, "I completely believe you." As a matter of fact, I had something like that happen to me twice, once in that same place and the other in that building behind you, as he pointed at our jailhouse. Again, I know that sounds completely cliché with that grudge-like moan we had heard, but it honestly happened, and it still brings those tears of fright into my eyes every time I tell it. I went back to that storage area only once after that, but I never went down that road again, and I never went after dark. During my days as a Marine, I had many different jobs on site, but my least favorite was graveyard patrol. At one point, I was one of the few with the overnight graveyard patrol shift for a nearby memorial cemetery. As you would imagine, it was a pretty slow shift with not much going on. Oddly enough, even though the cemetery was in a remote location surrounded by dense forest on each side, and I was working the literal graveyard shift, I found the job more relaxing than scary or unnerving. I would be the only one in the cemetery. My relief would come around 5 a.m., which would be the end of my shift. So this had to have happened past 3 a.m. near the end of my shift. It was the end of my shift. It was on this otherwise regular night that I was patrolling near the perimeter fence where some of the older headstones were. I wasn't allowed to be on my phone. If I were to be caught with my phone, I would be reprimanded, even though it was unlikely to be caught since there was no one else really around except for me. I tried my best to follow that rule, so it was just a lot of walking around and looking at old headstones. But anyway, while patrolling past some of the older ones, I began to hear a woman's humming. It was this very calming, soothing kind of humming, and I wasn't calmed or soothed because nobody was supposed to be in the cemetery. So it was more so a cause for concern. I started following the sounds of the humming. It was coming from behind this intentionally planted line of thick trees with vines and brushes sprouting from the sides of them. Instead of walking around the long wall of trees, I squeezed through the vines and bushes to the other side, cutting myself in the process. As I struggled to make it to the other side, the humming suddenly stopped as quickly as it started. I was left alone to the silence once again, not even the sound of a cricket. I walked closer to the edge of the memorial property by the woods near a few of the big mausoleum-looking structures, and I could distinctly hear some kind of buzzing sound coming from one of them. I stepped up the 3 white steps into the structure. The little door didn't have any kind of locks on it. I'd never been in any of these structures until this point, and I was incorrect in my assumption that they were mausoleums. I still don't know what the purpose of them was, maybe some kind of memorial building for deceased veterans in the cemetery. As I was inside that cold, dark structure, I could actually feel the hairs on my arms begin to stand up as I got goosebumps for reasons I wasn't sure of just yet. That buzzing sound was coming from inside of the structure, but it almost seemed like it was coming from beneath my feet. I looked down to the wood floor, and there were tiny round holes in each plank of wood. They seemed big enough to look through but way too dark down there to see what lay below the floorboards. I had an idea. I positioned my phone on the floorboard just right so that the flashlight would shoot light into the hole in the wood, and I would look through one of the other holes. I lay basically flat on the floor with my head pressed up to the wood, one eye closed. I expected to see nothing at all, but I saw what appeared to be the top of a woman's head. And as if she knew I started looking immediately, she looked up at me through the hole. I only saw her face for maybe half a second before I fell backwards and let out a blood-curdling scream. I sprinted back to the parking lot and called the guy who was supposed to relieve me soon and told him to meet me now. When he showed up, I tried to convince him that I was telling the truth about what I'd seen in that little building. He entertained me by coming with me to it, and I repeated what I did earlier with my phone flashlight. He looked through multiple holes but saw nothing. I had to check for myself, and he was right. It was just some small, empty-looking space underneath the structure. I spent the rest of the shift with him. I left at 4 on the dot. I know he didn't believe me. I wouldn't have believed me either. I'm sure it's a possibility that it was a hallucination as a result of my lack of sleep, but I also believe it's a possibility that I witnessed a spirit or something completely supernatural. I'd heard so many older Marines and veterans tell of supernatural experiences they had while serving. I don't know who the woman that I saw could have been if it truly wasn't my imagination, but it chills me to the bone to imagine it having been one of the women buried in the cemetery. Thanks for watching the video. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to watch the latest videos.